I want to give you 7 observations from the text suggesting that the gifts of tongues described in Acts was the same as that was described in 1 Corinthians 12 through verse 14. Here's what some people say. The tongues in Acts 2 is different than the tongues in 1 Corinthians. The tongues, can you explain why? Offhand? I'm just saying is that the way they justify tongues is that they say that the tongues in Acts and 1 Corinthians are different. Now let me give you first. The first one is same terminology. In both Acts, day of Pentecost, and 1 Corinthians 12 through verse 14, it is the same word. The tongues spoken in Acts by Peter are the same language in 1 Corinthians. So the language, the speaking in tongues in 1 Corinthians is the same gift that Peter had. The same word is used to describe the gifts of tongues. The primary word for tongues in Acts, Glossia, G-L-O-S-S-A, in chapter 2, verse 4, verse 11, 10, verse 46, 19, verse 6, is a Greek word that means languages. Thus, it is the gift of language. The tongues is a gift of language. As in Acts, the primary word for tongues in 1 Corinthians 12 through verse 14 is identical, the same Greek word. Secondly, same description. In both Acts and 1 Corinthians, the gift of tongues is described in ways that rational languages would be described. The miraculous ability as it is described in Acts 2 is a supernatural ability to speak in other tongues, meaning foreign languages. In 1 Corinthians as in Acts, the gift of tongues is described as speaking gifts. So a person says, I speak in tongues, but it's not like they spoke in Acts and day of Pentecost, but it's the gift that God gives me that He speaks up in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 14. That's how they'll justify it, because they realize the tongues that they're speaking today is not the same kind of tongue that was spoken by Peter. So you have to find a way to justify that.
Charles, doesn't also it say in there that the people there says, are not these men Galileans? And yet each one of us here in the language of the land in which we were born.
Right.
The thing of it is, Peter spoke Galilean.
I don't agree with that.
You know, I do. I mean,
Well, it's fine.
the Holy Spirit
okay.
is the one who
Peter
does the
spoke
interpreting.
Peter spoke in a tongue. Peter spoke in a tongue. That could be true. Peter spoke in a tongue because we're talking about tongues.
Yeah.
Galilean is not a tongue. Galilean is a language. Peter could speak a language.
Right.
So it would be a tongue. It would be speaking in tongues if he was speaking his native language. Now the point is, he spoke a language. He spoke in a language that encompasses what 18 nationalities that were there.
Yeah.
But the people that heard in their own language.
Yep.
You follow me? I think Peter spoke in he spoke in a language that they heard in their own language. God must have given them the ability to hear Peter's. See, Peter, if he spoke, but tongues is speaking in a language. Paul could go to any place in the world and speak their language, though he had never spoken it. That's a language, foreign language. So it says the same description. The fact that it can be interpreted or translated indicates that it consists of an authentic foreign language similar to tongues. So I'm saying is the kind of language that Peter spoke, that Paul spoke, was in a language that they could not speak, but the person could hear them in their language. Now, for instance, let's say that Peter went to Galatia, and I don't know what language they spoke, but he spoke their language. He couldn't speak their language, but he could not speak. But the gift of tongues was he was able to speak their language. Now, what he is saying is that Paul would go to a city and speak his own language, and they would hear it in their language. Now, that's not speaking in tongues.
Well,
If Paul went, let's say Paul goes to Honduras, and he can't speak Spanish, so he goes to Honduras and he speaks English, which is his native language, and they heard him in Honduras. He's not speaking in tongues. He's not speaking in tongues. He's speaking with his own language. I'm saying is that if a missionary speaks English, what does he have to do if he has to be a missionary to Costa Rica?
He has to learn the language.
He has to learn the language. Paul didn't have to learn the language.
But Paul could speak 7 different languages.
All
the known languages.
But that wouldn't be in tongues.
No.
Because he already knew them. If he already knows the language, that's not speaking in tongues. A language, speaking in tongues, was to be able to speak in a language that he did not know. God gave him the ability to speak in a language he did not know.
Didn't Jesus do the same thing?
Now, I don't think Jesus did that.
I mean, when he was talking to the people, did he speak a different language
I don't
than they
know.
understood?
I don't know. I don't know where that's in Scripture or not. But you're following me. If Peter,
Chapter 2 of Acts.
that's what it says.
That's they all heard from speaking the drum language, but they were all from different languages.
But they heard Peter's
They all
preach.
heard. They got the same message.
They got the same message because Peter spoke in a language. Now, in other words, if Peter was speaking in tongues, let's say that I go to Costa Rica and I have an interpreter. I'm speaking in English, but the interpreter is speaking in language. That's not me. I'm not speaking in tongues. But if I would go to Costa Rica and I don't know how to spell Spanish, I went to Guatemala and I was asked to preach in Frank Martin's church. I got up and I said, Lord, do I have the gift of tongues this morning? I would like to speak in Spanish. And nothing came. I had to have Frank to interpret for me what I was saying. I didn't speak in tongues, nor could I speak Spanish, but if I could have spoken Spanish, by learning it, I have not had the gift of tongues.
So because I can speak German, I have the gift of tongues.
You don't have a gift of tongues. You have a gift, but okay. All right. Number, same source. In both Acts and in 1 Corinthians, the gift of tongues was given by the Holy Spirit. All right, who gives the gift of the Holy Spirit? The Holy Spirit gives the gift of tongues. The miraculous tongues in Acts were directly related to the work of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit gives it. I think I gave you those notes, didn't I? In fact, tongue speaking is evidence of having received the gift of the Holy Spirit. As in Acts, the gift of tongues, 1 Corinthians, was directly related to the working of the Holy Spirit. Number 4, same recipients. In Acts and in 1 Corinthians, the gift of tongues was experienced by both apostles and non-apostles. On the day of Pentecost, it involved all those gathered in the upper room. Peter implied that the tongue speaking in Acts 10 was the same as that of Acts 2, even noting that Cornelius and his household had received the same gift as the apostles on the day of Pentecost. Number 5, same primary purpose. Here's what we're saying is, can you biblically say that what I'm doing today is the same that they did in that day? And they will, if you go to a charismatic or a Church of God or a Pentecostal, and they say, we will readily recognize that the kind of tongues we speak is not the kind of tongues that they spoke in the New Testament. Then it's not legitimate. They will recognize that they have it. In other words, but it's not a New. Then therefore, it's not a New Testament gift. In both Acts and 1 Corinthians, the gift of tongues was given as a sign to the nation Israel that God was now working through the church. In other words, God was saying, I want to reach out to the world with the gospel. I want to reach out beyond the Jews and win every tribe and nations of the world. And as a result of that, those who came to Pentecost were from different nations, different tribes. They were Gentiles, and God was saying even they can receive the Spirit of the Holy Spirit. And Cornelius was a Gentile. And he received the gift of the Holy Spirit because he understood, because the Holy Spirit gave it to him. So the purpose of speaking in tongues was to identify the power of the Holy Spirit and to bring people to Jesus Christ. Number 6.